Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. In the next half hour, then, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Guardian columnist, Zoe Williams, and the Telegraph's deputy political editor, Lucy Fisher. Great to see both of you. As ever, though, we start with the front pages. And the Eye reports that Boris Johnson is again set to put off introducing any new restrictions this week, despite record-high infection rates over the Christmas period. Same story on the front page of The Times, which reports that ministers believe there is nothing in the data to support new curbs. Backlash at masks in schools as cases ease is the Telegraph's headline, as Tory MPs call for a rethink over plans to curb infections in the classroom. Meanwhile, The Guardian says head teachers have been told to merge classes or switch to teach some classes remotely if staff are off sick. The Daily Mirror focusing on the staffing crisis in the NHS and reports that 1 in 10 workers were absent from work on New Year's Eve. And more pressure on the Prime Minister, front of the Mail, as Mr Johnson's backbenchers urge him to tackle soaring energy bills. Well, Zoe Williams and Lucy Fisher are here. Welcome to both of you. The holiday period feels like it's coming to an end. I know we've got a bank holiday tomorrow. Schools are going back. So the question is what happens now, which is what a number of the newspapers, Lucy, are tackling. The Times, for example, kicking off with ministers are now confident that new curbs for England are not needed. What are they basing this on?
Well, two very strikingly upbeat messages today from, firstly, Steve Barclay, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, who said he had seen nothing in the data so far to suggest there will be any need for new restrictions in the coming week. That sentiment was echoed by Edward Argar, a health minister, who also said he didn't expect there to be immediately imposed fresh restrictions. I think they're looking at the current data. Obviously, as we always know with ministers, that's caveated with the warning that the data can change quickly, and if the data changes, the government will act. But clearly, although cases have been high and hospitalisations are rising, and indeed Ed Argar predicted that they will continue to rise for quite a little while yet, potentially up to 2 weeks, he didn't think that there would be new restrictions. So I think certainly for Boris Johnson, he'll be breathing a sigh of relief, not having to enter into another battle with Tory MPs on that front of having to bring forward more draconian restrictions. But equally, certainly government sources I've been speaking to today suggest that when the MPs return to the Commons on Wednesday and we have a review of the current restrictions, part of Plan B, we aren't going to see any changes there. So there won't be a rolling back, but there won't be a rolling forward either.
Yes, I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it, what happens next? It's certainly a movable feast. If we look at the Eye too, the PM to delay decision on new COVID restrictions, the things at play here are what happened with that intergenerational mixing that we all did at Christmas, Zoe, the behaviour changes that we presumably did in order to safely see our older relatives, and then what happens when schools go back. So, you know, when will this all play out, do you think, when we know what might happen next?
Well, I tell you what's really interesting here is that all these front pages are part of the same story, which is that we've got this kind of huge soaring caseload, but we're not taking it as seriously as we were this time last year because we don't think the impact is as serious. And yet the way we deal with people who are COVID positive is the same as it was back when the impact was that serious. So you still have to self-isolate, you still have to test. And this is what's resulted in these vast numbers of people off work, you know, and that is set to continue. If you think there were 2 million people off with a positive COVID result last week from the 23rd to the 30th of December, 2 million people, that's 1 in 30 UK residents with a positive result. Unless you change the restrictions on people who are COVID positive, that will result in most of your workforce being off work. However, if you don't change that, but you don't change the restrictions on mixing and, you know, social distancing and so forth, the infections will continue to rise. So you're caught in this really uncomfortable limbo where you're responding in one way as if it's the old variant and in the other way as if it's just a cold. And that, I think, is what's going to really bite hospitals and bite the rest of the public sector and indeed the private sector. You know, nobody can survive with 1 in 10 members of its workforce off. No, that is the thing which will bring everything to its knees. So, I feel like there does seem to be reason to suppose that hospital admissions are climbing a bit, but hospital stays are much, much reduced in length, which does lead to the conclusion that it's less serious. But if it's less serious, then everybody will have to move quite fast to change the rubric and the protocols around COVID infection. Because if you keep on doing, you've got it, but you have to stay home for 10 days, then you're really going to be in trouble.
Yeah, but I suppose they have changed in the sense that they've reduced from 10 days to 7, the isolation period, plus testing on day 6 and 7, rejected what America has done, the CDC in the US, which is 5 days with no testing, so that's been rejected. And the other mitigation, I guess, is on the front page of your paper, Lucy, which is the face masks in schools. And your reporting, I think you contributed, did you not? Yes, your name is on it. That there's a backlash at this, even though some of the teaching unions have certainly welcomed it. The requirement to protect teachers, I guess, to stay in front of their classrooms.
Well, that's right. And the government has argued that this is a time-limited measure. It will be reviewed along with the other Plan B restrictions on January the 26th. And that while nobody wants to bring forward restrictions, particularly on children, that they see this as the only way, or at least a key way, to keep schools open and pupils in the classroom. That said, there is a lot of concern about this from, scientists who contribute to SAGE, from Dame Rachel D'Souza, the Children's Commissioner, who said today she was very concerned about the masks mandate for all secondary school pupils, and indeed an array of Conservative MPs I spoke to who felt that there is a real intergenerational unfairness to this, that this week we're seeing new restrictions only for the young, and yet they're the age group who, A, have suffered so much already during the pandemic, but B, are at so low risk of the disease themselves. It somehow seems unfair that they've got to change what they're doing when they're not at risk from coronavirus. I think the concern is about whether wearing masks can disrupt education, and also how it can potentially interfere with teenagers trying to communicate between themselves and socialise at school. So there are concerns about that. I'm told that the government is expecting to make a statement on this in the House on Wednesday. If they don't, I think MPs will certainly be tabling an urgent question about it. They want to debate this. They're pretty concerned about it. And I think this is far from the last we've heard about this issue.
Yes, and certainly the chair of the Education Select Committee, apologies Zoe, was raising the prospect of why are officers not required to wear masks, despite working from home directive, and children are.
Well, I would really put the teenagers' perspective here, because what they really hate is being stuck in the same classroom, which was the story of their entire last year. They were, one of the best things about being at secondary school as opposed to primary school is that you get to move from the science lab back to the language block, back to the art block, etc. They hated being stuck in one form room because it made them feel like little kids. They hated being stuck in a bubble, having to self-isolate if one of their bubble got infected. There was loads and loads of things that they really didn't like, being forced to play outside, not allowed in the library. They don't mention masks. They never mention it. They never mention that it disrupts their teaching or disrupts their socializing or disrupts their look or disrupts how cool they feel. They've got so many other complaints that I really see masks as a tiny thing compared to the other measures, which many schools put in place for really good reasons, which they experienced as a real curtailment of their education. And the other thing I would say is that if you look at the Guardian's front page on this, the government is doing this absolutely on the hoof in a way that I don't think is true of the rest of the requirements. And I think there's much more pressure on the government from their own backbenchers mainly about, are you going to make a decision on social distancing? Are you going to make a decision on vaccine passports? There's much more pressure there. And then at schools, they kind of scattergun out these bizarre requirements like merging classes. What does that even mean? Year 7 and year 11, year 7 and year 8, how big can a class get? There is no clarity. And it's Sunday night. A lot of people go back to school on Tuesday. So I think this kind of indicates a real lack of respect for the education sector as a whole.
Yeah, it presumably means merging classes when you've got two forms of the same age range in a year, or you've got eight.
Well,
Some
does
schools
it?
are really big, But yeah, but I mean, the difficulty is that obviously, the infections that children have spreads to their parents. Then you feel like you can't go and see your elderly relatives because your children are exposed at school. So it has a really big implication, the infections that are driven from school, about how you mingle with the rest of society. So.
Well, absolutely, but that's exactly why the measures should be A, discussed with schools ahead of time, and B, should have a lot more plainness and legibility than what's coming out at the moment. This is kind of, a lot of it is nonsense, kind of hybrid learning. It doesn't have any meaning unless you say we want this much to be at home and this much to be at school. And certainly to release it less than 48 hours before kids go back to school is incredibly slapdash.
The Daily Mirror refers to something you've already talked about, both of you, which is the staffing issue, raising the cases of the hospitals across Lincolnshire, which on Saturday had to have an internal critical incident declared across the trust. This is I've written it down, I've now forgotten it, the United Lincolnshire Hospitals Trust, which said that due to extreme and unprecedented workforce shortages, we are unable to maintain safe staffing levels, including those around stroke and cardiac care, which is a great difficulty. They couldn't maintain a number of key pathways in that. Is this the problem with this, Lucy? Is it the first of many? Do you think trusts declaring these issues with the staffing crisis at 1 in 10 NHS staff absent from work on New Year's Eve?
Well, it certainly could be. The government has asked local leaders to draw up plans for a worst-case scenario of 1 in 4 public sector workers being off at any one time in coming weeks. I think that would just be an absolutely crippling effect on any NHS hospital trusts if that's the case. Really worrying to see what's happened in Lincolnshire United Hospitals, where they've had to admit that the quality, the safety of the quality of care they were offering was damaged by staff shortages. I think that longer term, the government is now trying to move to sort of mitigate high demand periods, whether that's winter crises, public health emergencies like the pandemic, other major events like terrorist attacks. I know that they are about to start to roll out nationwide a reservists scheme for NHS, both clinical and non-clinical staff, loosely based on the Armed Forces Reserves or the Police Special Constables Force. I think that's hoped that will recruit tens of thousands of former or retired nurses and doctors, other people who work in logistics and IT, to kind of come in and help the health service when it's undergoing difficulties. But certainly in the weeks ahead, I think it's going to be really worrying. And the figures that on New Year's Eve, 1 in 10, that's 110,000 people in the health service were off sick or self-isolating or off for other reasons, is really worrying indeed.
Yeah, and I suppose the hope is for government, and we wait to see what happens, is that, looking at South Africa, this is a short, sharp peak, and we can start to see the downward tread quite soon, but we have to wait and see what happens with schools first, don't we? Lots more on that, no doubt, to come throughout the evening, but also ahead, more pressure on the Prime Minister from his backbenchers amid warnings over an energy bill crisis. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now are the Guardian columnist Zoe Williams and the Telegraph's deputy political editor Lucy Fisher. Welcome back to both of you. So, Zoe, let's go to the Daily Mail, shall we? Pressure on the Prime Minister again over energy bills, this cost of living crisis, which is the next big thing on his agenda, no doubt, on his desk for the new year.
I mean, this is an absolutely disastrous story for the Prime Minister, not just for his political prospects, but also for his temperament, because truthfully, the energy bills are going up and up and up anyway. The price of gas is rising astronomically. It's like when you look at the cost per therm, you just can't even wrap your head around what the impact has been. But it's not even that cold at the moment. So, temperamentally, Boris Johnson is predisposed to think, let's cross that bridge when we come to it. And until it gets that cold, he's not going to cross that bridge. But meantime, this is going to cast so many families into poverty that they've never experienced before. Even families that wouldn't think of themselves in poverty are going to really feel the pinch on this. So, what you ideally need in a situation like this is somebody like Gordon Brown, who can imagine it being cold, even when it's not cold. But instead, what you've got is a Prime Minister like Boris Johnson, who can't imagine it being cold, even when it is.
So, but what action would he take, apart from to damage the coffers of the Treasury? Because it would be an expensive business, would it not, to intervene, Lucy, do you think?
Well, yes, it would. I mean, what MPs are calling for is twofold. One is to scrap the green levies on utility bills, which would save households up to £200 a year. Interestingly, even clean green energy bosses have been calling for that, arguing that these green levies are a bit outdated now. They were introduced years ago when it was really expensive to produce renewable energy, and it was the funds raised were used to subsidize that. So even those bosses are saying that we don't need that anymore in terms of subsidizing green energy. And secondly, particularly for the right-wing Brexiteers in the Conservative Party, they want to see the freedom from the EU. Boris Johnson take advantage of that to scrap VAT on energy bills, which is currently levied at 5%. Again, it's not a very progressive move because it would actually help people in the biggest houses with the biggest bills most. So some other critics think it would be better for the Chancellor to use some of the additional VAT raised by rising energy bills to try and target more closely helping hard-up families who are struggling to pay for energy.
I would disagree with that slightly in the sense that everybody always talks about renewable subsidies, but the fossil fuel industries are also subsidised with tax breaks. We just call it something different. So, if you're going to... the truth about renewables is that they've been massively subsidised, and rightly so, at a governmental level. And then that subsidy has been passed on to the bill payer as a result of political decision-making. But equally, fossil fuel industries are massively subsidised at a governmental level, and that levy is not passed on to the taxpayer or the bill payer. So, we really need to reconfigure our language so that what we're talking about is what we mean. Because the notion that fossil fuel industries are somehow self-sufficient and don't need the government is for the birds.
OK, we were going to talk about Prince Andrew. He's on the front page of the Times. A veteran of the Grenadier Guards has become the first to go on record, they say, in calling for the Duke of York to step down from his role as Colonel of the regiment. We will no doubt talk about that in the coming days, though. But Zoe, Lucy, thank you both very much indeed.